Hello, from Joe and Mike's Virtual Tours of Scotland. I'm in Stockbridge today and I'm going to give you a little guided tour of the neighbourhood here, and I'm starting off in St Stephen's Street, so hope you're all well and safe. So I'm going to be pointing out some of what goes on in the present day, as well as some of the historical characters and events that happened going back a bit. So to begin with, I'm going to swing us round a bit so you can have a look at this building here. It's quite a tall building. It's St Stephen's School, 19th century building. Today been repurposed into apartments, and these apartments are quite large. In fact, I know someone who stays in here, and from the back they can get wonderful open views looking over Edinburgh's new town, and up at the top there's an open Bible. And of course that connects with the connection with religion and education, certainly going back to the 19th century, and a bit later it wasn't unusual for us to have church schools. Now this is quite a narrow street here, St Stephen's Street, and it's one way, so we've got traffic passing every so often, and I'm trying to keep to the sunny side of the street, but we're going to move over a bit more into the shade here and have a look at this wee building here. Now the brick building is very unusual, not just for Stockbridge or St Stephen's Street, but for Edinburgh generally, and it's a dance school today, but this happened to be St Vincent's Church Hall back then. So once again a building which has been successfully repurposed. Now take a swing around a bit and you can see the curvature of St Stephen's Street, quite unusual in that respect, in that towards the end there it's curving up to the right, and you can see some more modern buildings around the corner there, but have been built to tie in with the older buildings. Now what used to be there, going back to the 1980s, was a dance hall, and it was called Tiffany's Dance Hall, and then it changed its name to Cinderella Rockefellers. So the atmosphere and people down back then, it would have created a very different setting. So sadly the dance hall, Cinderella Rockefellers, was destroyed by fire in the early 1990s, and of course with the open space very much desirable, then they built new housing there, new apartment buildings. So swing back down again, a little view of the other side of the street, and that's looking down into Stockbridge. Another thing about this street is that it's built on a slope, and if you can see, maybe looking at the road, the tarmac, it does slope down from the left to the right, and that is continually sloping and it's going down towards the water of Leith. So the foundations for buildings here had to been a kind of stepped arrangement where you've got lots of outlets and accommodations below street level, and we're just coming up to one now on the left hand side. So looking down, we've got quite a well-known public house called the Antiquary, and there's been a pub here for about 35 years. And if you can just imagine, when the dance hall was still back then in the 1980s, you would be getting various bands and so on populating the bar here, and people who were going to be attendees at the club and the dancing. But of course time moves on, and once again there's quite a different atmosphere in the pub today. Now the Antiquary, you may wonder, why is it called that? Well, Sir Walter Scott's book called The Antiquary, it was a novel that was published in 1819, a rather accessible story I can recommend if you haven't read it. It was one of the Waverley novels, and the character, the Antiquary, was an amateur historian, collector, archaeologist if you like, and Sir Walter Scott kind of fancied himself as a bit of that, so it's kind of autobiographical. Today the pub quite picturesque inside, and on the beams in the ceiling they've got various fragments of literature that you can see. including Sir Walter Scott. It's also a favourite place for people to come and play music, especially on a Thursday evening when there's a traditional Scottish music session happens here. And it happens to be my wife, Linda, accordionist, leads that session. And you can come along, you can bring an instrument, you can come and sing a song, open session, and as you can see, down steps, very much fitting into the atmosphere here in St Stephen's Street. It does have a ghost. In the 19th century, there happened to be a bakery behind here. And if you go towards the toilet areas in the bar, towards the back, you can still see in the cellars some remnants of that original bakery. Sadly, it went on fire, and some people say today, when the bar is quite quiet, you can hear a child or a boy calling out for his mother, and apparently that is the baker's son. So a kind of melancholy, sad little story there. So yes, there's this sort of stepped arrangement because the street, if you like, is falling down metaphorically on from right to left now as we look along to the eastern end of the street. And this was quite a working class area in the 1960s, St Stephen's Street. And as you see the street curving uphill, it is leaving working class into gentility, into some rather large, expensive apartment buildings in the new town of Edinburgh, 19th century Georgian buildings. So it's a link between what was a village, milling village, was Stockbridge back then, into the more aristocratic, if you like, wealthy area of Edinburgh's new town. So take another little scan around and you can see some old shops still there after many years. We've got Mr. Purvis here, the lamp shop, and once again we have got areas below street level, very typical of here. Bookshops, many sort of independent outlets here today, which is rather nice, and down below is the Blue Parrot there, Cantina, Mexican restaurant, rather good Mexican food where we will go occasionally, and that has been there for quite a long time as well, and it's still under the same ownership. So take another little scan around and have a look at the architecture, and on the other side of the street you can see got golden hair books, and of course during COVID and such like, people have been reading books more than ever before. So just take another little walk along here, and you've got this vintage clothing shop here called Miss Bizio Couture, and the owners of this shop, they're locals, and they've also got a little art gallery in the Rayburn Place, and just next door, Italian cafe here, Sprio. Hello. Hello. Just doing a little live tour and pointing out the businesses in St Stephen's Street. So, okay. So quite a mixture of shops here. It's quite a picturesque street. It's got a long history of having antique shops, maybe not so many today, but certainly during the 1960s. And we did talk about Mrs. Doubtfire. I won't go over that again too much, but with regard to vintage clothing, second-hand clothing, and Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor during the 1960s happened to be spotted here browsing around the shops. All right, so still quite a sought after place to come to. So the sun's coming out. So here I'm just going to be walking down now to the Stockbridge market down St Stephen's Place, and if we swing around here, the sun's coming out nicely just now too. You get a nice view of that beautiful entry to the market. Now, why was the market here? Well, you may know about how the new town of Edinburgh was built in the 18th century, how people started leaving the old town. It had been a old town way back in at least the 12th century, and before that the old town of Edinburgh. And when this village of Stockbridge, which was a milling manufacturing village, began to develop, then we had a certain landowner called Henry Rayburn, who was also a portrait painter, and he owned many lands, and he loved it here, and he wanted to develop it as a more residential place. And even for some of the wealthier citizens of the new town of Edinburgh would want to come down here with the greenery and nature and so on. But one thing it was lacking, because it became overwhelmed as it began to expand, was food shops. So they decided to develop this market, but the food shops were still, or rather markets were in the old town of Edinburgh. If you went to Market Street and just under North Bridge, if you're familiar with the old town, that's where you get your meat and fish. And if you went up to the Tron on the Royal Mile, you would be getting fruit and vegetables and so on as well. So you can see this is quite elegant, and it was developed in as late as 1825, because they were very much aware of that lacking of a market, and built by a gentleman called Archibald Scott. And we've got the Greek Doric architecture. So we'll take a little wander down. There's no market here, sadly, because it didn't take long for the shops to recognise there was business to be had here. Started opening up, and in the early, kind of later on in the 19th, early 20th century, the market sadly closed. And today, again, repurposed some of the space here. You can see green space and people's gardens here also. Now, Stockbridge was known for being a centre of milling, and the milling of grain. And this building here is called Mill House. It's a residential block of apartments, but stands on the site of a grain mill, which sadly exploded in the early 20th century. In 1901, it was called Todd's Mill. And of course, here was another empty space which was developed for residential use. And but still, you can sometimes see the remnants of some of these buildings that were here before. So it was very industrial. There was lots of tanneries, there was lots of milling going on here as well, and also the movement of livestock and so on across the Stockbridge, which we'll be having a look at later on. So we're moving gradually through the arches here. There's quite an unusual architectural feature here. If you look through, we've got two arches, right? You can go through either one of them, and that's going to lead on to Hamilton Place. But in between there is this big block, circular block, and that's because there is tenements, so like apartment buildings up above here, and to access them, this is the stairwell, this big circular bit of wall that you can see here. Yeah. So we're going to walk out now into Hamilton Place, and of course here is the public toilets today. But believe it or not, that used to be the fire station back in the 19th century. You hear a wee bit of an echo in my voice just now. In the days that fire engines or fire wagons, they would be pulled by horses. So again, a repurposing very successfully of an older building. It's getting a bit more busy now because we're coming more into the centre of Stockbridge. And I'm going to swing us around. That's the library there. That building looks a bit like a castle in the sunlight. I want us to have a look up here, and you can see, if you look very closely, there is ghost signage. And that means lettering faded from what this used to be, and this was going back to the 19th century. And you may be able to make out the letter M in between the first two windows there, and if we move further over, you can see U, and then you might have to have quite a detailed eagle eye to see this. There's a S, and then there's E, and these are about 2 metre high letters, and then there's U, and then there's M. Now, this used to be a museum, and we're going back to the 19th century. It would be the time that Sir Walter Scott and some of these great enlightened figures were around. Of course, there was no mass media as we know it today, no radio, no television, and this was a museum of curios, believe it or not, and it was a collection gathered by a Mr. Gray, and it was called Mr. Gray's Museum, and it had the likes of stuffed birds and animals and interesting stones and rocks and shells, and also a sword believed to have been left at the Battle of Bannockburn. So the museum sold off the collection in 1834. So we're going to move around again, sunlight bathing the landscape just now too, and look over the wall. That building you can see with the tower and the clock, it used to be a bank, and it today has been repurposed and it's Pizza Express. And you can look over the wall there, have a little view down into the water of Leith, but we're going to move along a little bit as we go here. A lot of sort of greenery, you feel as if you're in a village a lot of the time, and that's one of the attractive things that brings many people here. Now, I was talking about a certain Mr. Henry Raeburn, or Sir Henry Raeburn, famous portrait painter of the 18th century. He was born here in Stockbridge, and he was of a humble background. His father was involved in textiles as a yarn boiler, and the young Henry Raeburn achieved a lot of success when quite young as a miniature painter, and he made a very, very good marriage. He married this widow, and she was quite a wealthy widow, and she was called Anne Edgar, and her husband had been James Leslie, and he had held estates down here, and through that marriage Henry acquired quite a lot of wealth, and who had been quite humble, not too wealthy portrait painter. Then his professional career certainly took off after that. He had issues with regard to bringing up Stockbridge as being a place for people to come and stay, as I mentioned earlier, rather than a simple village. And we can see we're on the old Stockbridge, or rather Stockbridge at the moment, over the water of Leith, and we look over the wall, we see the water of Leith down there, see Pizza Express there, and it's beautiful, nice and sunny just now. It was very much an industrial village, and it serviced its great neighbour Edinburgh, but he, because it was close to his heart, developed it, and through his wealthy, successful friends, including one James Milne, he was able to start building rather beautiful houses and what we call Georgian architecture. So we've got a lot of that today, and Stockbridge has moved away, of course, from being an industrial manufacturing place, as it had been as far back as the 17th, 16th century, to be quite a bohemian, arty, desirable place to stay. So I get another little look at some of the outlets here as we're moving down. All the things you need, and in fact Stockbridge has got known as having more charity shops in Edinburgh than most other areas. A little look over the other side there. So Stockbridge then, it was widened by James Milne, made better in 1801, under the influence also of Henry Raeburn, Sir Henry Raeburn, as he later became. So you've got the sets, or cobbles as we call them. You've got the little streets off the main street, which is Raeburn Place, which we're going to come on to shortly, and you can see down there the water of Leith, just down at the bottom again. So walking down on the sunny side of the street, trying to social distance here. School's on its lunch Oh no, it's not. It's on its break, I think, on its morning break. And Rayburn Place, which is named after Sir Henry Rayburn, of course. Rayburn had some issues in 1815. There was a mill owner called Andrew Kedsley. Now remember, this was the Industrial Revolution, where machinery was being upgraded, who installed a steam mill, or steam power to power his mills in Stockbridge, and this created a lot of black smoke and noise, and Henry Rayburn took out a court case against Andrew Kedsley to try and get him to close down his mill because it was so inconvenient. People were getting smokeness on the washing, laundry, and bits of black flecks on the clothing. And this went on and on. Famously, an example of a NIMBY not in my backyard a kind of court case. It wasn't successful for Henry Rayburn. He didn't win the case, but it was helpful for anybody installing machinery in the future, in that they had to go through various different rules to be able to do that. So it wasn't quite so easy to do it. But from a humble milling background himself, Henry Rayburn was almost rebelling against what his father and family had been doing. So, famous case, Kedsley against Rayburn. Now I'm showing you this here, polar ices, because going way back now, this was a company who had very great ice cream, Italian Vincent D'Angelo, who lived in Stockbridge, and he was a character because he used to be seen pedaling around on his bicycle with his ice cream, selling it to the public and getting quite a big reputation. And this kept going on through the 1950s and 60s. People still today can remember polar ices, and you can see the ghost sign up there today. This is where the ice cream vans would used to have been kept. It's another little beautiful little street down there, Malta Terrace, some other wonderful Georgian houses down there, but we won't go down there today. Keeping on the sunny side of the street, and you can see all the busyness and activity. Many people come to visit down here. It's so picturesque. It's not just people who stay here, who come down here to shop. It's got a lot of small shops, a lot of independent businesses. But again, because of COVID, we've had various businesses failing and people going off and doing other things. So we're moving along here. We've got extra pedestrian space, which is good, so that we can social distance as well. And this is Studio Bizio. This is Joanna Black and Andrew Black, little gallery, and they also own the Bizio Couture, if you remember the vintage clothing shop that we had a look at in St. Stephen's Street. I'm taking you along here because I want us to have a look at this. Is an old established business going back to at least the 1930s and probably before that. Otto Gall, who was Polish, who was an immigrant, who came here and started a barber shop. And there's old photographs. In fact, some people say it might go back as far as the 19th century. And we'll take a little look inside. Very traditional barber, and I love this. Open when we're here, closed when we ain't, and it's like a museum piece in here. You feel as if you're really stepping back in time. And next door, the Henderson Art Shop once again. I find this very handy because I stay in the area. It's great to have an art shop on your doorstep. So we're going to cross back a little bit. We'll talk about somebody else, a man called James Young Simpson, who came from a large family. He was born in Bathgate, and he was from a family of bakers, and his brother was a baker, and he came as a young medic studying medicine at a very young age to stay with his brother at number 1 Rayburn Place, and we're just going to head for that just now. Looking over here. So we're just going to cross the street. I hope you're enjoying this. I certainly am, and it's a beautiful sunny day today, blue skies, as you can see, crossing over Rayburn Place to have a look at number 1 Rayburn Place. So here is Pepe Nero today, another new business. So James Young Simpson lodged here with his brother, and at the age of 19 he was such a high achiever. He became what was called a licensette of the Royal College of Surgeons. He would have become a member had it not been for his young age, and at quite a young age he moved from here to 2 Dean Horse Street, which is further up there, and put a brass plate and it said Mr. Simpson Surgeon. He was just incredible. He became Professor of Midwifery at Edinburgh University at the age of 29 by a very slim margin. It was all to do with seeking votes from your supporters, and he wasn't going to achieve it until somebody walked into somebody else's shop, and that somebody else happened to be a bailey who is like a high up person in the council, and they intimated to this bailey, who was Mr. Andrew Tate, that Simpson shouldn't really be a Professor of Midwifery, since he was just a baker. And at this, Mr. Andrew Tate, he took great umbrage. He was not happy with that at all, so he quickly took his apron off from his business and rushed up to cast a vote for James Young Simpson. And Simpson did manage to get the chair at Edinburgh University. Now, Simpson is very well known. He is known as being able to identify how chloroform can be used as an anaesthesia. Before him, it used to be for the treatment of sore throats. He was very much against pain. Didn't matter what class. He would treat the Queen Victoria, but he would treat the poorest people in Edinburgh's Old Town, and women especially. He thought about the pain they had to undergo in childbirth. So he was a very important figure. We sometimes talk more about him when we're in Queen Street in Edinburgh in the New Town, but it was down here in Rayburn Place in Stockbridge that was the groundwork for him, for his practice. Now we're on Dean Street. It's another of those beautiful streets that maybe many people don't know exist or don't happen upon. So we're walking up here. Of course, Dean, it was the name of the Dean estates here. So we're just carrying on up here, and I'd like us to have a look at this Georgian house, 19th century house. This was the home of Vincent de Angelo, a member of Polar Ices. And if you look maybe carefully, just under the top floor window at the right hand side, just underneath, there's an oval shape, and there used to be a little dedication to the fact that this is where Vincent stayed, because they had a cafe in Stockbridge, and that's where they used to make the ice cream, where the ice cream factory was made. And it was so loved. And of course, we looked further down the street, not far away, is where the garage for the ice cream vans happened to be, down at the bottom there. So we'll swing around again. Hidden history. Sometimes, plates have been removed, plaques have been removed, because people may not want to have people looking in their windows or looking at the outside of their buildings as well. So coming down here in the sun-bathed colours of the flowers, and on the left-hand side, this building, it seems a bit out of place, very large, the one with the cream frontage, the United Presbyterian Mission Hall and School, as it was originally. And again, we're going back to the 19th century here. So we'll just let the cars pass here. Yeah, there was lots of secessionist church groups we talked about Thomas Chalmers and the breakaway from the Church of Scotland into the Free Church of Scotland. And it was a time people were looking for different messages from those who were involved in running the church. So the United Presbyterian was one of those secessionist churches. Now, this was repurposed, and it was actually in the early 20th century when they moved away from here, the church, and it became the Pavilion Picture House. And it existed as that until it changed its name to the Dean Picture House. It finally closed in 1936, and then at one point the National Trust had their offices here as well. And you can see the elegant doorway. You have heard me talking about fan lights. Well, this is just a fantastic fan light, very much connected with Georgian architecture, and you can tell a very important person or group would have occupation here. And the street, although a narrow one-way street, can be quite busy, and when it's busy you can hear the rattling of the traffic over the sets. It can be quite noisy. Getting busier as Edinburgh begins to open up. So there is a view of what used to be the United Presbyterian Church and Mission House, and then it moved away to another premises, and here it is here, somebody else's house, but if you look above the doorway you can see that's got it, the Dean Street United Presbyterian Church Mission Hall, which moved here. We'll take another quick scan around. See, it goes from being quite quiet to being quite noisy and busy. Either one thing or another. On the left hand side we've got what were previously mews houses where coaches would be kept. You can see the entry there for coaches and horses for the accommodation of the wealthier citizens who would stay on the other side. So, quite a beautiful little street. So, thank you very much for joining this little tour of Stockbridge. Hope you enjoyed it, and see you next time. Bye for now.